to subdue the peninsula.
They actually literally signed a compact. You will be the religious leader and I will be the political leader, and we will try and take the whole peninsula.
It would take nearly 2 centuries, but in 1924, descendants of Saud finally conquered Arabia. They now controlled Islam's holiest cities, Mecca and Medina. 8 years later, the modern state of Saudi Arabia was established, and the stringent doctrines of Wahhabism became the law of the kingdom. But it was not Wahhab who would create a fundamentalist doctrine for the modern age. That task was taken up by an Egyptian journalist who built on Wahhab's philosophy to create his own interpretation of the Quran, one grounded in violence and steeped in controversy. His name, Sayyid Qutb. 1918, the end of World War I spelled the final collapse of the faltering Ottoman Empire. Across the Middle East, Arab lands were divided up between European colonial powers, which established secular and often oppressive regimes. This was the world in which Sayyid Qutb, born in Egypt in 1906, grew up. As a young man, Qutb was neither radical nor religious. A journalist and a scholar, his work took him to America in 1948. There, he was shocked by what he saw as a decadent society, and his radicalization began.
When he came to the United States, he was largely secular. So I guess one has to believe him that what freaked him out about the United States were 2 things. One was the segregation and the racist laws which were still in force. The second thing was women. He was totally taken aback by the freedom with which women transported themselves. This came as a big shock to him.
When Qutb returned to Egypt, he joined the Muslim Brotherhood, a political organization that opposed British colonialism and advocated a return to the time when the Quran was the law of the land. Qutb's transformation accelerated when, in 1954, Egyptian President Nasser began a crackdown on the Muslim Brotherhood. Qutb was arrested and put in jail.
It was really in the dank and sadistic prisons of Nasser's Egypt that Qutb, who was repeatedly tortured, who saw so many of his fellow Muslim brothers tortured and murdered, that this radical reinterpretation of the Quran took hold of him, where he no longer believed that preaching and living a good moral Muslim life was enough to change Muslim and Arab society, that it required a revolution.
His interpretation of Islam became an interpretation of Islam under siege and of Muslims under siege.
In prison, Qutb wrote 2 of his most important works, a commentary on the Quran and an incendiary political manifesto titled Milestones. Like Wahhab, he argued that the Quran alone was the source of knowledge and the guide to daily life. Qutb believed that only by returning to the, quote, true faith could Islam be saved. Qutb also found in the Quran the justification for armed struggle against those who stood in the way.
What Sayyid Qutb did is to go to the scriptures and, in effect, say, look at the scriptures, look at those sectors of the scriptures that talk about what do you do when you're under siege, what do you do when it's a war between belief and unbelief, and he used those texts to legitimate what he was doing.
His argument is that the world has changed and that the Muslim governments are no longer properly defending the world of Islam against incursions from outside. And so, he argues, each individual Muslim must now take the responsibility of military jihad on their own shoulders.
Throughout the 1960s, Qutb's writings struck a chord with many Muslims in the Middle East who had suffered for years under colonial rule. Qutb reinforced a growing sentiment that colonial rule was the equivalent of a new crusade.
That ideology proved to be an inspiration. And so Qutb is both an inspiration to mainstream, if you will, Muslims and Islamic activists, as well as to a whole variety of extremists that developed. This runs right down to people like Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda.
The legacy handed down by Wahhab and Qutb to Muslim extremists in the decades to follow would cause many, Muslim and non-Muslim alike, to take a closer look at the Quran, triggering a debate about the true meaning of its mysterious verses. For more than 14 centuries, the Quran has been a source of guidance for Muslims around the world. But what believers find in its pages has often depended on what they are looking for. Like nearly all holy books, the Quran contains a host of meanings that are sometimes contradictory and difficult to reconcile. There are numerous verses that call on believers to live peacefully and to create a society built on justice and understanding. Chapter 16, verse 90. Behold, God enjoins justice and the doing of good and generosity toward one's fellow men, and he forbids all that is shameful and all that runs counter to reason. But other verses in the Quran command Muslims to rise up in arms against non-believers. Chapter 9, verse 29. Fight those who believe not in God, nor acknowledge the religion of truth, until they pay with willing submission and feel themselves subdued. In recent years, a relatively small but growing percentage of Muslims have found in verses such as these the justification for a violent ideology.
There is, in a very real way, a struggle for the soul of Islam between a majority and a minority. A minority that is a minority, but that is dangerous and have an impact beyond its numbers.
In 1998, Osama bin Laden quoted one of these verses. Fight and slay the pagans wherever you find them, seize them and take them captive, and lie in wait for them in every stratagem of war.
Osama bin Laden quoted from the Quran and also the example of the Prophet in order to try to justify his actions and the actions of these other radical leaders in pursuing their form of jihad.
But Muslim and non-Muslim scholars alike point out that bin Laden's use of the Quran is selective and distorted.
What's interesting is that when we go back and look at the verses of the Quran that bin Laden quotes, he plays with them in a way to make them seem more military than in fact they are. He quotes one verse that talks about the need to fight and kill the unbelievers. And that's where he stops. But the verse continues.
It also says, but when the enemy ceases to be a threat, when it ceases to fight, then remember that God is merciful, remember that, warfare is not the primary way that you should go.
Scholars argue that this type of distortion is common among radical Muslims who insist there was once a time when followers of the Quran accepted a single interpretation of its words and lived by that interpretation.
This conception that there was this one version of Islam that we can go back to before it was fractured and separated into these competing versions of Islam is simply untrue. It never existed. From the very first moment in which the Prophet Muhammad revealed the very first words of the Quran, it was absorbed and understood and interpreted in wildly different ways by a whole host of different people within the community.
Whether the Quran should be used to condone acts of terror goes to the heart of the crisis within Islam today. The roots of that crisis can be found in the struggle that nearly all other great religions have faced: how to maintain the status of their sacred text in a modern world that seems to deny its relevance.
Islam and Muslims are going